introduce our guest for the evening, um, Mr. Shivakumar. And thank you, Jairaj sir, for making that um, short introductory welcome.
I want to say a few more things before you
Please
introduce
go
him.
ahead, sir. Please go ahead, sir.
Yeah. So Shiv, thanks again for joining us this evening at this distinguished lecture series organized by Captain Nagaraj Subbarao and his colleagues. The reason why I wanted Shiv to join this series is because, I have seen him for many years because he was a successor of mine at the All India Management Association as president. And more importantly, for an audience like this, he is an industry icon, a corporate leader of distinction, and most important, a Bangalorean at heart and at spirit. So he's speaking about globalization. What next is exactly the subject which I think your audience requires, Captain. And
Yes,
so
sir.
over to you, Captain, for the formal introduction. Thanks again, Shiv, for acceding to my request and coming here this evening.
Pleasure.
Go ahead, Captain.
Thank you very much, sir. And I would just like to add that our Honorable Pro-Chancellor, Dr. Premchandra Sagar, was to attend, but he's engaged elsewhere and he sends his best wishes. So good evening and welcome to the Distinguished Speaker Series brought to you by Executive Education, Dayanand Sagar University, Bangalore. I would like to welcome Mr. D. Shivakumar to this webinar on globalization, what next? Shivakumar, or Shiv as he is popularly known, is currently the Group Executive President at the Aditya Birla Group for Strategy and Business Development. He joined the ABG Group in January 2018. Prior to this, Shiv was Chairman and CEO for PepsiCo for 4 years, and before that with Nokia as CEO for India and later emerging markets for nearly a decade. Shiv has been a CEO for half his career and is one of the youngest CEOs in India. He has worked in Hindustan Unilever Limited for a number of years, mostly in marketing. Shiv has worked with over 50 brands in his career and seen many business transformations. Shiv writes and teaches regularly on innovation, leadership, followership, business models, digitization, etc., across the leading business schools in the world. He is an avid sports watcher, a great fan of Manchester United and Barcelona football teams, John McEnroe and Roger Federer in tennis. Shiv is a believer in giving back to society. Shiv has been on the board of governors of the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, between 2012 and 2017. He was on the Godrej Consumer Products Board between 2009 and 2017. He was the president of the All India Management Association in 2012-13. He is currently the chairman of the Mobile Marketing Association and chairman of the Advertising Standards Council of India. He is currently on the board of XLRI, Jamshedpur, and IIM Udaipur. Shiv has been awarded many times in his long and illustrious career. Best CEO, Best Brand Builder for Leadership, for Turnaround, etc. The awards most dear to him, however, are the 2 Distinguished Alumnus Awards he got from IIT Madras and IIM Calcutta. He is only one of the 20 people in India to have Distinguished Alumnus Awards from both the IIT and IIM. Shiv is married to Hamsini, who runs her own brand innovation and semiotics consulting company. I would like to welcome Mr. D. Shivakumar to this webinar. Thank you very much, sir, for being here, and over to you.
Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I see that we have close to 300 people on the, or close to that on the webinar, which is good. I'm going to talk about globalization, what next. And the reason I'm doing this is Mr. Jairaj. Mr. Jairaj, who was president of All India Management Association a few years before me, the former chief secretary of the government of Karnataka, and currently on the board of governors of the Dayanand Sagar University. So when he called and said, hey, Shiv, I'd like you to do this, I can never say no to him because he's been a dear friend and a good mentor. So what I'm going to talk about is globalization, what next? Globalization, simply defined for everyone, is the interdependence of culture, economics, and people. That's what it is. The interdependence of culture, economics, and people, that's what is globalization. And that's what I'm going to cover over the next 40 minutes. Next slide, please. So I personally believe that there has been no playbook for globalization. Every large enterprise talks of globalization. My hypothesis is that it's happened through a series of events, and various leaders have tried to ride the global wave and then make themselves into a global organization or have a global mindset. If you look at what is a global mindset, it is the ability to absorb information, tradition, and culture so that you can create impact in that country. The ability to absorb information, tradition, and culture to create impact in the country. Globalization or a global mindset requires the intellectual, the psychological, and the social insight. All three are important if you truly want to be a global citizen or a global manager. Next slide, please. As I put this presentation through over the last 1 week, I went back many hundred years. In fact, I would say I went back 1,000 years. In 1,000 years, I've taken 12 events. The bulk of them are after 1945, but I've taken 12 events which I believe, or the forces which I believe have shaped globalization. Okay, I picked 12 for you, and my story of globalization and what I'm going to talk about is through the eyes of these 12 events. Next slide, please. At a fundamental level, globalization started in the 17th century when immigration started. In the 17th century, if you wanted to go to America, you wanted to go to Europe, all you needed was to get onto a ship from Bombay and it would take you. There was no visa, there was no passport, there was nothing. So immigration started in the 17th century. And a lot of people from Europe, and specifically the United Kingdom and Ireland, went to America. The reason I have the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island is that if you go to Ellis Island in America, which is next to the Statue of Liberty, you can actually see all the ancestors from the 17th century who came into America. So immigration was the first level of globalization. What did immigration do? It brought new language to the table into a new country. It brought new food into the country. And it brought new religion into the country. It brought Jews, it brought Protestants, it brought Catholics, all kinds of people. Okay, it brought Muslims, it brought Hindus, everyone. So immigration aided the first start of globalization in the 17th century. Next slide, please. The next one is global universities. Global universities, Oxford has been around till from 1096. That's 1,000 years ago. Oxford split into Cambridge around 1200, and Cambridge has been there for 800 years. Harvard has been there from 1636, which is 384 years. And our own Presidency College in Calcutta has been there since 1817, which is 203 years. If you wanted to study in the 16th century, in the 12th century, in the 18th century, you had to go to one of these colleges. And that's why a lot of the freedom fighters of India in the late 18th century had gone to each of these institutions, the great institutions, over time. So these became the bedrock of some kind of thinking around globalization and culture. Next slide, please. The first real momentum towards globalization, immigration and universities were very small. The first real momentum for a number of things towards globalization and global institutions came with World War II, 1945. During World War II, American forces, wherever they were in the world, in Germany, in Philippines, every other place, the American government set up bottling facilities to manufacture Coca-Cola. At the end of the war, believe it or not, they sold each of the factories to Coca-Cola for $1. And suddenly, Coca-Cola had rapid presence across the world. Wherever American troops were there, you found Time magazine, you found Wrigley's chewing gum, and you found Camel cigarettes. All three of them were given to American soldiers as part of the American deal. In fact, the current format of the Time magazine that you see, Time magazine was much bigger. This format was actually developed so that it could be tied and thrown from a helicopter or from an aircraft so that troops could read about America. So wherever you go in the world, if America has been in that country during World War II, you will see these four brands. So World War II was a defining moment for globalization. Next slide, please. In the 60s, we started the generation of the transistor. And the people who actually wrote the transistor wave was Sony. And suddenly Sony became a global brand in the 1960s because of the transistorization. This is one of the early pictures, and you can actually see the line at the top. It says transistorized. Okay, today we take transistors as a given, and almost everything to do with the radio is on your mobile phone right now. Next slide, please. Number 5, global trend number 5. In the 1960s, we saw management concepts going global. Peter Drucker, whom I have to the extreme left, started in 1945, and many of his books went global. In fact, it will interest you to know, Bangaloreans, Mr. Jairaj knows this, Peter Drucker came in the 1960s to address the Bangalore Management Association, believe it or not. It's the only management association in the country that he's addressed. Philip Kotler wrote a defining book on marketing that went global. Paul Samuelson wrote a defining book on economics that went global. In the last 25 years, we've seen Ram Charan and we've seen C.K. Prahalad continue that legacy of management thinking going global with their concepts. Next slide, please. Number 6. The oil shock of 1973 was possibly one of the biggest, triggers or events to start a very new wave. American cars till 1973 were huge cars, big bonnet, big dicky, whole works. The oil shock suddenly told them that they cannot guzzle oil the way they had been guzzling so far. And suddenly, small cars from Japan took off on the back of quality initiatives from Deming, and then whole lot of small cars went into America, and America became a huge market for Japanese small cars. The advent of the small car was an outcome of the oil shock, and suddenly America woke up to Japanese products, first with Sony and second with cars. Next slide, please. Next slide, go forward. This is a very interesting thing. In 1974, Ali challenged Frazier for a match. And this match was fought in Zaire, middle of Africa. It was fought in the night. In 1974, ladies and gentlemen, there were 1 billion people who watched this. People paid $50 for satellite television to watch this. To put it in context, 2019 Cricket World Cup, there were 705 million unique people who watched it. In 1974, Ali versus Frazier was watched by 1 billion people from America to Philippines. This was one of the fundamental events which made global sport possible, global televised sport. So, and hence I pick it as a defining moment. Next slide, please. In 1985, Bob Geldof got together a bunch of musicians to say, we need to save Africa, and Africa is undernourished, malnourished, we need to contribute to Africa. He bought the best bands, and here I have for you ABBA, Queen, and Dire Straits. And they performed live at Wembley, and this was broadcast globally. The beneficiaries, of course, were Africa, but more important, the beneficiaries were global rock stars. Music went global in 1985 as a result of this absolute fantastic event. Next slide, please. 1991, I'm sure a lot of you can remember this. 1991, the Iraq war started. When Iraq war started, 24/7 news became the norm, and the winner became CNN. After that, if you look at it, across the world now, you have 24/7 news. What's the advantage of 24/7 news, and what's relevant to globalization? It is relevant because anybody, anywhere, whether it's BBC, whether it's CNN, whether it's any Indian channel, right through 24 hours, they can keep the feed going. Any news anywhere, irrespective of the time zone, is absolute breaking news. And now with smartphones in people's hands, okay, you have every citizen as a journalist. They click it, they post it, and then send it to CNN or BBC or India Today, wherever it is. And suddenly 25/7 news is the norm. And this completely changed the way the world thought about news and the way the world thought about themselves. Next slide, please. Around the 90s came the GSM standard. And it's a very important reason why I put this. Whether it's Motorola, whether it's Nokia, whether it's BlackBerry, whether it's Sony Ericsson, everybody adopted the GSM standard. Adopting the standard ensured that phones could be made at mass scale and low cost. Adopting the standard ensured that all the equipment manufacturers around the telecom industry had standards to work with. And later on, I'll explain how the GSM standard has really made the world a global place. Next slide, please. The Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall happened between 1990 and 1991. When the Berlin Wall came down, communism gave way to capitalism. But today, if you look at it, especially in a post-COVID era, we are seeing socialism everywhere. We are seeing grants by the American government. We're seeing grants by Germany. We're seeing grants by UK. Everybody is out to protect their citizens. So communism came down with the wall, went to capitalism, flourished for a while in globalization. Today, everybody is back to socialism. Next slide, please. In the 2000s, 20 years is all I'm talking about, just the last 20 years. The rise of the internet has given us these brands. Go back, please. Google, Facebook, WhatsApp, PayPal. These are brands born out of the internet. Because they're over-the-air brands, you can tap them anywhere in the world as long as you have a network. Next slide, please. And my last and defining event of the last 1,000 years is China as the global hub of manufacturing over the last 30 years. Since 1990, China has become the absolute hub. It's the world's largest exporter. 12 to 15% of China's GDP is exports. It exports close to $2.5 to $3 trillion, which is the size of the Indian economy, to all parts of the world. These were the 12 defining events in my book, which I could pick from maybe 100 or 1,000 events to tell the story of globalization. Next slide, please. So the question for a company when you talk of globalization is very simple. Next slide, please. The question for a company is, do I do one versus many, focus versus spread? On the y-axis is the number of countries. In the world, we have about 210 countries. So the number of countries is 0 to 200. On the x-axis is the number of businesses, or number of categories, or number of brands. That can be 2,000. So if you look at it, the whole concept of globalization is, I can have a few brands or a few business. I can have a beverage business in 150 countries. I can have one brand in 100 countries. Or I can have 500 brands in 20 countries. This is the essential challenge of globalization before any company. How many brands, how many businesses to have, and in how many countries? That is the critical question. And if you can answer this in a simple manner, based on where you're strong at, that company succeeds. Next slide, please. So if you look at brands which are available in more than 200 countries, if you travel the world, brand Coca-Cola is available in more than 200 countries. The only two countries where Coca-Cola is not available is Cuba and North Korea. Colgate is available in all countries. Google is available in every country which has internet. Visa is available. PayPal is available. These are all brands. Facebook available in 200 countries. Next slide, please. These are brands available in 160 countries. Dove, Maggi, Nescafe, Toyota, Pantene, Pampers, Huawei, and Lenovo. So if you look at the technology brands, suddenly you have Huawei and Lenovo, which are available in 160 countries. They have virtually become the standard in most countries. Next slide, please. So what helps globalization? I believe global standards, having global standards, or the lack of it, not having global standards, actually helps globalization. And through examples over the next few slides, I'll show you where standards have worked and where standards haven't worked, and why we haven't had globalization, because the standards did not work for the world. Next slide, please. Here's a great example of standards working. The QWERTY keypad, which started with the typewriter, and the telegraph did dot, etc., which started, way before. Imagine the world if QWERTY standardization was not there. Every single typewriter, every single laptop, every single mobile phone will have its own configuration. Indians will have their QWERTY, Taiwanese will have their QWERTY, Americans will have their QWERTY, somebody else will have their QWERTY. It would have been the most confusing thing to ever deal with. So having a standard of QWERTY, which started with the typewriter, has helped many generations of hardware products like laptops, like iPads, and phones, all three. This is an example of a great standard which has continued over 200 years. Next slide, please. Look at traffic lights. Wherever in the world you go, red, orange, green is traffic lights. Imagine if a country had a different traffic light and you were to go there. You would just lose your brains. Here's a great example of the whole world adopting the same standard to traffic lights. So every single driver, every single pedestrian knows what red, orange, and green mean in all the 200 countries of the world. So here's Washington, here's Russia, here's China, here's India. The same traffic light, the same standard applies everywhere. That helps. Next slide, please. All of us travel. When you travel abroad, the biggest challenge you have is language. You don't know whom to ask for what. If you look at the world's airports, look at the symbol design in each of the world's airports. Baggage claim, very simple design. Toilets, very simple design. Medical assistance, very simple design. Gates, very simple design. Car park, very simple design. Where the train is, very simple design. Duty free, very simple design. Prayer rooms, very simple design. So anybody and everybody can just look at this sign and say, hey, I know where to go. So having a global standard around symbol design in airports has helped many a traveler. Next slide, please. Where are industries or situations where we have not had a clear standard? I've given you all examples of clear standards, but there are many industries where there are no clear standards and we're tearing our hair to say, why the hell hasn't there been a standard? Let's take a look at a few of the non-standard approaches. Next slide, please. Cars is a very good example. You have left-hand drive cars, you have right-hand drive cars, based on the legislation of the country. Imagine if the whole world had only one set of cars, either left-hand or right-hand. Imagine the economies of scale, imagine every single thing that would have worked for that industry. But unfortunately for us, we split as left-hand drive and right-hand drive. I give you a simple example. Let's take a simple thing like a pen. There is no left-hand pen and right-hand pen. It's only lack of a standard which made cars left and right hand. It does not function any differently. It's what I call irrelevant difference. Next slide, please. Look at electricity and plug points. Wherever you go in the world as a traveler, you're completely confused. Which plug point do I take? There's a 3-pin, there's a 2-pin, there's a 3-pin small, there's a 3-pin big, all kinds of things. Because power was generated, distributed, and managed at a local level for years. And that has led to massive confusion. So when I travel today, I have a pouch of about 5 or 6 plug points. I have to carry all of them and to keep checking whether one works for the other. So this is a great example of zero standards. Next slide, please. Here's another example, which is cell phone chargers. Around the year 2009-10, as part of Nokia, we tried to get the industry by 2012 or 13 to have one common standard. And a lot of people agreed. But then again, things went differently. And since Nokia was no longer the powerhouse or the sun of the ecosystem, nobody else could take that role. Here, if you look at it, if you go to an airport today in India, there is a charging machine and they put 10 different brands and each different brand has a different, charge point. Imagine if all cell phones could be charged with one charger. What a difference it would make and how life would be simple for anybody. But today, because there is no standard of chargers, we have an absolute plethora of confusion which reigns in this industry. Next slide, please. Apparel and shoes is another great example. Just look at the size, look at what it is in USA, Canada, UK, Europe, Japan. The numbers are all over the place. So not having standardization of a particular size actually hurts this industry. And I personally believe anybody who can actually get to a standard will actually win. Next slide, please. Global sports. Barcelona, Manchester United, Roger Federer, Tiger Woods, Formula One Ferrari, Los Angeles Lakers. These are all global properties. All these brands have gone global. You go anywhere in the world, people recognize a Manchester United or a Barcelona. Anywhere in the world, people will recognize a Ferrari. Okay, so these are properties thanks to television. Go back to what I said about Ali versus Frazier, 1974, 1 billion people watching it. These are properties which have been built on the back of television. And they're all global franchises and they have a global footprint in terms of their fan base and customer base. Next slide, please. If I were to name one brand of the 60s or 70s, which was an absolute rage, which was the most aspirational brand in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was Levi's jeans. If any of your uncles, aunts, parents went abroad, you tell them, buy me a pair of Levi's jeans. This is the kind of advertising which Levi's used to do in the 1960s. It was truly one of the most iconic global aspirational brands. No longer so, I must admit, but definitely for 3 generations, 60s, 70s, 80s, nobody could touch Levi's. Next slide, please. Let's look at regional sports. Sports and franchise which have regional appeal. IPL is a very good example of that. Its appeal limited by and large to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, maybe a bit of Australia, a bit of England. All of American football, all of American baseball is linked only to America. Even though they call it the World Series and World something else, it's essentially played in one country, which is America. So India, IPL is the biggest event in cricket. It's played in one country, which is India. So these have not been able to transcend the world. Next question, please. Next slide. Once in 4 years, you have the Olympics as well as the World Cup football, which come along. And suddenly, these two sports, whether it's the Olympics across all its disciplines or football, they capture the imagination of the whole world, specifically World Cup football. Everybody gets involved. The success of the last World Cup was Croatia. Nobody knew Croatia or spelled Croatia till Croatia went to the finals. And then everybody's got to know about Croatia, the country, the culture, the prime minister, and everybody else. Okay, so this happens once in 4 years, and there's a huge globalization frenzy which happens as a result. Next slide, please. So, while I've talked about a lot of the big events across the world, it's also important for me to signal what India has given the world. And India has given the world quite a lot in terms of globalization. India gave the world zero, very critical in everything. India gave the world yoga. India gave the world the flush toilet from the Indus Valley civilization of the 1500s. India gave the world the snakes and ladders game. India gave the world shampoo in the 15th century by mixing herbs with avla. India gave the world radio broadcasting from J.C. Bose. India gave the world fiber optics from Narendra Kapani, who was a professor. India gave the world the USB port, which is standard feature in all laptops, via Ajay Bhatt. And India gave the world Bollywood. Bollywood is all about soft power, not hard power. Soft power is the ability to influence via culture, something which others aspire for. All the ones which the star in them is from the BBC 4 list. Zero and Bollywood is what I've added, which all of us know is, a given. Next slide, please. So now we come to COVID. COVID-19 is a global pandemic. Okay. This is like the Spanish flu, which was there in 1918 and 1919, exactly 101 years ago. So now we are in the COVID era. This is a global problem. We've had global lockdown for the last 45 days in almost every country. Some countries are opening up. Some states and some cities in India are opening up. Now let's look at what happens to globalization in a post-COVID world. And I have 5 slides and thoughts for all of you. Yeah. In 2017, after President Trump was elected, The Economist said this. The Economist said the President of the United States of America plays 2 roles. The first role being the President of the United States, and the second role is the leader of the free world. And The Economist said, Mr. Trump is reluctant to play the second role, which is the leader of the free world. Which leads me to my next slide, which is, who will step up and build consensus? Why do I say that? Number 1 and number 2 are fighting. The largest economy in the world, USA, 22 trillion, is fighting with the number 2 economy in the world, which is about 14-15 trillion. The 2 of them are fighting. When giants fight, who is going to step up to build consensus? Will it be Europe? Will it be Japan? Who else can do it? Will it be India? I don't know. So fundamentally, if you think of globalization from now on, there is no single leader who can pull it together. This is a very important point for you to think about. Because in the last crisis, which was the 2008 financial crisis, we had President Obama convening the G20. He got all the top 20 economies in the world and said, how do we address this financial crisis? And out of that came a plan, and everybody agreed to that. Today, the question before all of us, who is going to step in and come with a global answer? All of us, I believe, are searching for that answer, which is a very important answer towards the next step of globalization. Next slide, please. I believe till a vaccine appears, globalization will be in recession. Because countries have put up borders. America has put up its border saying no immigration. Other countries in Europe have put up their borders. India has put up borders. Flights are not operating. Nobody is willing to go to any country. So nothing can move. No man, no woman, no machine, no goods, no services can move today because everybody is worried about COVID-19. The day we find a vaccine and people say, I can have the vaccine and then travel, then the whole concept of globalization will start again. So currently, in the phase right now, for the next 1 year at least, I believe globalization will be in recession. The country that gets the first vaccine will win big. It will win big commercially, it will win big as an innovative hub, and it will win big in soft power. People will quote that country for the next 100 years as the country which saved the world. Next slide, please. I believe across the world, the 200 plus countries will split between those who believe in China and those who don't. Some countries will believe in China, some will not. The companies in those countries will follow suit. So I believe globalization will take a step back as a result of this sharp divide between countries which will believe China, companies that will not believe China. Next slide, please. If you look at it, we are all looking for trust cues. We need trust for the globalization to happen and for all the big parties to gain. Let's go back. If I look at it today, all the world institutions are struggling. I marked 1945 and World War II as a very important milestone in globalization. Let me explain why. The World Bank was started in 1944 as the Bank of Reconstruction and Development and the International Development Association. The World Bank was absolutely critical in redeveloping Japan. Without the World Bank, Japan would not have developed. So the World Bank started in 1944. The World Health Organization developed in 1946. The United Nations turned the League of Nations, which was there in 920, which was ineffective, and the United Nations was born in 1945. The Red Cross was born in 1863. So if you look at three of the big global institutions, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations, all three were born as a result of World War II. I believe you'll see some such thing post-COVID. Unfortunately, the institutions we built, the global institutions we built for the global world, today everybody is challenging them. The same people who built these institutions do not want to fund them. The same people who build these institutions do not want to listen to them. And this will be the challenge for globalization. You have global institutions who can play a role, but you do not have global support from the leaders who have created those institutions in the past. So I believe we are in a trust deficit as far as globalization goes. And all of us have to work together to ensure that we bring the trust cues to the table. Next slide, please. So in summary, I would say I'm on my 32nd minute, so I'll give you back some time. I would say that globalization has been around for many years. I've looked at globalization by taking 12 defining events in my book. I say my book compared to, I could have chosen 20, 30, but I chose 12. I started with immigration in the 17th century. I then went to universities, people like Oxford and Cambridge, etc. And then we moved step by step through management education, through the Berlin Wall, through the standards, every single thing, through the Ali versus Frazier fight, through down to COVID. Today, there is nobody to stand up and be a champion of globalization. Today, everybody is standing up and knocking globalization. This is bound to happen when you have number one and number two fighting with each other and calling each other's names. So leadership has to step up. Maybe a union will step up. Maybe a bunch of leaders will get together and say, we cannot allow the world to go out of gear. Maybe that will happen, and we should all look forward to that. The country which develops the vaccine will be a global thought leader, will be a global innovation leader, will be a global soft power leader. All three will happen. Countries will be aligned by countries which trust China or fall behind China, and countries which do not trust China. Finally, it is time for us to revive the great world institutions like the United Nations, like the WHO, etc. These were institutions built to ensure that the world was a better place. Today, for whatever set of reasons, the very same governments, the very same people who built these institutions are tearing them down to pits. So I believe globalization is in recession for the next 1 year at least. And it will need remarkable leadership. It will need collaboration. And globalization is all about appreciating the other person's culture, the other person's psychology, the other person's religion, and the other person's practices. The more we are tolerating of what has happened, the more we will win, and we'll get back to a saner world. So that's all I have to say, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for dialing into this webcast. Finished at 34 minutes. I'm more than happy. We are at 7:41. More than happy to take questions for the next 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. That was an enthralling short journey in globalization. What next? Particularly your views on the last couple of 100 years. And I've got some interesting questions. I would like to check if my colleague Rahul Dige is around. Rahul, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So I will read out some of the questions, and I'll try to organize them in the best manner possible because there are questions around various aspects of your talk. So one question, of course, in everyone's mind maybe is in this, as a result of this, is there a likelihood of a large opportunity shift from China to India, and how do you see that?
So I personally believe no. If I look at, I mentioned that the China supply chain and the China dominance in electronics, footwear, apparel, socks, etc. has been built over 30 years. For any country to build it, you need access to raw material, you need access to capability, and you need access to foreign markets. All three are important. Okay, and Bangalore, where you sit, is a great example where TI, okay, started with the Software Development Center in 1984. It's taken us 16 plus 20, 36 years to be the powerhouse that we are. We export $147 billion of software. Now, why can't every country do it? It's not easy. So while we might win, I believe it won't be tomorrow morning. Most people think it's going to be tomorrow morning. I don't think so. The Indian economy is domestic led. It's private consumption led. So I think our immediate focus is to get that right. And then after that, look at markets and actually pivot to see which new products and new services the world will want.
Great. So, of course, there have been a couple of announcements only yesterday about the government saying that we should actually become more self-sufficient and things like that. And I know that, you're welcome not to answer this question, but there are questions around this. So, is there something that the government is specifically sort of trying to push towards local economy and local production and local consumption? Do you see that happening?
So I would say there are 64 million MSMEs. Only about 10 million of them have a formal system of provident fund, this, that, etc. Most of them are in the informal sector, number one. Domestic consumption, as I mentioned, will be critical. And here's my submission to you. At the end of the day, in no country do people buy any product or any service which is not of topmost quality. Every country which has tried to do that has suffered. So the challenge before the MSMEs, given whatever support they have, whatever it is to actually produce top-notch quality products. If we do not, and this is linked to your first question which you asked, if we do not have a global standard in terms of quality, why will we win in an export world? So that's where the contradiction is. So we have to be truly global in our approach to quality and value. And then people will buy you for whatever it is. If tomorrow India made a car for 1 lakh rupees, which was a fantastic car, it will give every single global brand a run for its money. And the history of India is we've had many of these short-lived things. We said we had a phone for 251 rupees. That never took off. That was wrong. We had a tablet which people said is for 1,000 rupees. Again, that never took off. So we get into a lot of these announcements without getting the basics and the quality right. So my submission is, it's absolutely important to nail that. If we nail that, then we are fine. Otherwise, no.
Okay. So you mentioned, there's one question about your mention of the current recession, quote unquote, in globalization. So how do you see, and this is a question from Professor Jasirani, how would localization bring, is it possible for localization to bring win-win situations to the economies? And what are your thoughts around that?
Not true. If you look at a top 10 list of exporters and importers, okay, that list roughly matches. I think India will be low on the export list at 191, at $348 billion, and it's high on the import list because of oil at $480 billion. Okay. Now, if you look at most of the countries in the world, their populations are small. The only 3 big countries which have the power of both domestic market and can do something in terms of exports are China at 1.4 billion people, India at 1.3 billion people, and America at 322 million people. That's all, only 3. Every other country, be it UK, be it Germany, etc., they need a combination of both. So just being national and local will work exceedingly well for China, India, and America. Unlikely to work for all the other countries.
Okay. So when we talk about, you talked earlier about some of the global brands or global products that India has given. which came out of India. But if we really talk about a brand that sort of originated in India and went completely not completely, but I mean to a large extent global, we sort of struggle to find those examples, right? I mean, what is the fundamental sort of reason behind that?
I think it goes back to a number of things. It's about scale, it's about quality, it's about capability. But to be fair, if you look at the software industry, I think whether it's TCS, Infosys, Wipro, they've all built global brands and very powerful global brands at that. Okay, while we might not have very powerful brands in the consumer space, we don't have powerful brands in the car space, definitely. But certainly, almost certainly in the software services area, we built a lot of powerful brands.
Right. So maybe the distinction, I mean, this is out of my personal interest. There is not a question around this from anyone else, but we had a discussion and we had a talk earlier where there was a discussion about India and the need to innovate. And is it the case that we have now sort of gotten to a point where we are averse to taking non-linear risks, where we invest, build products, take some risks, and then reap sort of large benefits out of that investment later? And are we too, when it comes to being global players, are we too sort of services oriented?
I would say that an impediment? Go back to what I said about standards. One of the things about consistent long-term winners is a process and a standard. Japan took years. Japan had a perception of shoddy quality. It took years for Japan to change that under Deming, etc. They learned the lessons and they went forward. So you cannot, Indians tend to celebrate things like Jugaad, innovation, this, that, etc. We shouldn't be doing that. Innovation is a thorough process. We must follow it. We must have the patience for it. If you want to take shortcuts, life is not full of shortcuts. One shortcut can give you a result, but in the long term, shortcuts do not get you consistent success. So I think having institutions of repute, having capability of repute, and following a process is actually very, very important. And that's what I would truly look for. And there are many companies and many industries which are doing that. And I think more will do it. The more India gets systematic in its innovation, the more it will win. Next, innovation requires integration between the educational institutions, the PhD students, the industry, R&D, society. You need a collaboration of that. Only when you get that right will we move forward. So it's just not a simple answer. I think you need to build for it. And wherever you build for it, I think we will gain.
Right. And I remember exactly the comment that you made about Japanese goods being sort of quote unquote called Japanese stuff. And I remember my father telling me that they were considered substandard goods. And the way we kind of sometimes look at Chinese goods today is how I think Japanese goods used to be looked at. And they made made progress by leaps and bounds over decades. So that's a story for I think all of us to kind of remember when we go back to our jobs and when we try to innovate and not really look for, I think essentially what you're saying, I gather, is not look for that one quick lightning bolt that will change the world, but continuously, consistently innovate. Right? I mean, that's what I gather from it. Very, very useful insights. So I think we have covered pretty much most of the questions. There are a couple of questions which are sort of specific to companies. I don't know if it would be appropriate, but I'll air them anyways.
I wouldn't do that. That would be unfair.
Okay, great. So I think we have pretty much gone through most of the questions. I would like to request if Captain Subbarao has any of his questions or any other participants would like to add some questions. Captain, are you there?
Thank you, Rahul, for moderating this program. Sir, I had a quick question on Carlos Ghosn. Carlos Ghosn in Japan, Renault Nissan, was said to be the cultural ambassador of his country in Japan and celebrated as a cultural ambassador and so on. And it ended in a bit of a fiasco. So my question is that, of course, we all understand cross-cultural management is extremely important. Um, what is your opinion on that? Because uh, again, there is a divide on Carlos Ghosn and his role. So do you think that expatriates traveling abroad is going to continue, or in a world closing down, it's going to sort of reduce in momentum, and we're going to have less expatriates? That's my question.
I don't think so. At a first level, I would say talent will always be global. If you're good, people will want you. Then it's your choice whether you want to go there, work, whatever it is. India has enormous opportunity. China has an enormous opportunity. America has an enormous opportunity for talented leaders. So that's why a lot of these people tend to stay in that country. So talent, like capital, will flow to the place where it believes it has the best house. There's absolutely no doubt on that. Carlos Ghosn was an absolute star of the automobile industry. The absolute star. What he achieved in terms of the cost to make a car and really turned around Nissan was a remarkable story. Absolutely. Now, here's where, now what I'm saying is not based on facts, but just, some thoughts. The Japanese culture is a very hierarchy culture. If you've ever been to a meeting in Japan, there are only two people who speak, the boss and the presenter. Nobody else speaks. Okay. So in societies like that, things tend to happen. And I use happen, in quotes. Pause for a moment about Renault and Nissan and think back about what happened to Olympus. Olympus was a company which had its first CEO from outside of Japan. He went there and he suddenly realized that the books were not in order. Okay. And then he blew the whistle on his own company and then he went out. And I remember Stephen Sokor interviewing him in a Geneva business school. And I happened to be in the audience. And Stephen Sokor asked him, how did you feel? He said, I was very scared. And even when I was talking about my company, I realized that nobody else will hire me ever again. So there are many things about societies which lead to many events. I don't think the last has been said about Carlos Ghosn. He's right now in Lebanon. I personally believe he will write a book. I personally believe there will be a movie about his escape. Okay, and slowly and steadily we'll get to know more. Okay, so I don't think the last word has been said from the car company on their relationship with their former CEO.
Thank you, sir. And the last question, which I can't resist, which comes from my colleague, Commander Himanshu Joshi, who's a close China follower and a naval aviator. So he says, do you think China has overstretched and is now, kind of imploding, that they've gone so far without having a proper back office? So they're creating problems for themselves by overstretching. That is his question.
I don't know. Difficult for me to answer without the data, points. But at one level, what you say is right. Every company, okay, let me start. Every individual, every society, every company, and every country which stretches lands in some kind of a problem. Okay, we know individuals, definitely. Let's take companies. Let me give you 3 examples. Toyota, Volkswagen, General Motors. All 3 of them stretched to become number 1 in the world by number of units sold. And all 3 of them ran into quality problems. Volkswagen, the gas leak, Toyota, something else, etc. Let's look at a society where you sit, sir, Bangalore. For all its growth in Bangalore, we are severely challenged on traffic. So somebody could ask the same question, right? Has Bangalore stretched beyond its limits? And the answer might well be yes. And similarly, a country too, when a country stretches beyond its limits, it's quite likely that it has some kind of challenge. So I don't know which industry of China, certainly, but time will tell is all I can say.
Thank you very much, sir. It's been an absolute honor and privilege to have you here today at Dayanand Sagar University Distinguished Speaker Series. And I would also like to sincerely thank Mr. Jairaj, IAS,
Yes,
an advisor.
my mentor and friend, absolutely.
Yes, sir. and he is our mentor and friend too,
Absolutely.
for being here and taking part in this webinar. I must thank my wonderful team for putting up this webinar: Dr. Rahul Dige, Professor Rajan, Aravind, Mohammad Imtiaz, Malati, and Professor Naveen Sriram. We have some wonderful speakers coming up: Dr. Srinivas Gorti from Austin, Texas, Mr. Vinod Philip from Berlin, West Germany, who will speak on energy, Professor Richard Boyatzis from the Western Case Reserve at Cleveland, Ohio. Those are our next three distinguished speaker series on the distinguished speaker series. Thank you so much, sir. And I would thank the participants for being here today and turning up in large numbers. We had a record attendance of 300 people. We're giving out a participation certificate for being here, and Professor Rajan has shared the link. So you can click the link and collect your certificate. Thank you very much and good evening.
Thank you, guys. God bless.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.